Ah, the old optiplexes. They're quite the workhorses, showing you how just by adding a graphics card, you can use a decade-old PC to play the latest titles, and at surprising quality. But, is the CPU in there holding you back, and is it worth it to upgrade? Well, let's find out. In this video, I'm going to be comparing a Core 2 Quad E6400 and a Xeon X3220. I'm using the Xeon instead of a more traditional Core 2 Quad because I just happen to have one lying around, but also because it has near identical performance to the very popular Q6600. Other than that, I'll be using 4GB of RAM and a GT 1030. I chose these because they are reasonable upgrades for a computer like this, a couple extra gigs of RAM and maybe a budget graphics card. Because no one's going to be putting a 1080 Ti in a computer like this and seriously using it. So now that we've got the specs sorted, let's jump right into the benchmarks. We're starting off with some CPU benchmarks so that we can get a good look at exactly how much more performance you'll get from the X3220 compared to the Core 2 Duo. For this, I chose Cinebench and Blender Classroom to test a real-world workload while also keeping it strictly CPU-based, so we can get like a direct comparison between the two processors. As you can see, the X3220 stomps all over the Core 2 Duo with almost triple the performance in both benchmarks. This is a positive start, but it doesn't mean you'll get triple the performance in games. So now getting right into the games, let's start off with Fortnite, because how could you not in 2018? Right off the bat, you can see that it looks pretty good with the Xeon. The frame rate holds steady at about 50 to 60 FPS without any major stuttering or other problems. There really isn't that much to say about it, because there were no problems with the gameplay, other than, my complete lack of skill, but let's not worry about that. On the other hand, on the Core 2 Duo, while the frame rate might not seem so bad, even in video you can see that there's major stuttering, and that's actually the least of its problems. After dropping in the first time, none of the buildings wanted to load in, meaning that you're not able to gather materials or even really get a weapon, so, you can't play the game. I tried a second time to make sure that this wasn't just some kind of fluke, and on the second try, it was a bit better. The first time I went to, all the buildings loaded in, as usual, as you would expect. But as soon as I started walking away to the next town, Tilted Towers in this case, the buildings again would not load in until about maybe 30 seconds later, which is honestly just unplayable. You can't play like that. So for Fortnite, the upgrade to the Xeon was pretty substantial. Even though on this chart it might seem like the Core 2 Duo was perfectly fine, hanging around 54 FPS, when actually playing the game, the challenges became pretty obvious. Next up we have GTA 5, because it's a large open world with lots of AI and lots of things going on. And while it did present a problem on both processors, it might have actually not been 100% the processor's fault in this case. As you run through the first mission in Los Santos, you can see that this experience with the X3220 is pretty smooth overall, with about 37 FPS average. The problem starts to come in when stuttering appears as you move over large parts of the city very quickly. This, however, is likely not due to the speed of the CPU itself, but rather a limitation of the 4GB of RAM we have installed. This can be seen as after each of the stutters, the CPU usage plummets, meaning that the CPU is not the bottleneck in this case. On the Core 2 Duo, it's kind of a similar story to Fortnite. Nothing would load in, and the game was actually pretty unplayable as a result of that. So for example, after this failure of a cutscene, it actually dropped me in the wrong spot to start the mission, and once I tried to go to the house where I was supposed to pick up the cars, the gate wasn't open, so I couldn't actually go that way. So, not to be defeated, I went around, through the road, and came to the spot where the cars should be. Where they should be. But they're not here. Of course, why would they be here? So I went to the highway to pick up a car and drive down into the city as you would in the regular mission. And wow, it wasn't pretty. This, however, unlike with the Xeon, is completely the CPU's fault. The RAM is not the limiting factor in this case. Running the in-game benchmark actually summarizes these findings very well. You can see the X3220 doing generally well with pretty good average frame rates, but then the stuttering just comes in and kind of ruins the experience. And then you can also see at the same time how the Core 2 Duo can't even run the game properly with huge chunks of it missing and the benchmark actually breaking. I've never seen that happen before, but the Core 2 Duo managed to somehow break the GTA 5 built-in benchmark. And from that point, it took it a full 4 minutes to even actually fully construct the scene that the plane was stuck at. Again, for GTA 5, the upgrade to the Xeon was pretty big, but it still wasn't quite enough to push into playable territory. To play a large open world game like this, you're really going to need more than 4 GB of RAM. Now let's take a look at Rainbow Six Siege. This is a competitive shooter game, so staying close to that 60 frame per second target is going to be crucial to deliver a good experience. And the X3220 delivers. Throughout my playthrough of the suburban extraction situation, it was able to consistently deliver a frame rate of over 50 FPS, only dropping down to the 40s once or twice. And once again, I find myself not having that much to say about the experience, and that's good because it means I had no problems with it. And, once again, it's a different story on the Core 2 Duo. While this is the first game so far where it's been able to load the entire game in, without having huge chunks of the map missing, this is where the improvements end. Immediately, you can notice the almost half frame rate compared to the Xeon. And perhaps even worse is the audio, which comes super cut up, and it's ridiculously annoying. Though to be fair, this is so far the most playable game by far, if you can overlook the audio issue. Switching over to the in-game benchmark, and it's more of the same. The Core 2 Duo has an almost half frame rate compared to the X3220, and the audio issue still persists. Though, interestingly enough, the benchmark actually takes a longer time to complete on the Core 2 Duo, which is just kind of odd, and can be seen as these two videos start to deviate over time. When using the Xeon, Rainbow Six, like many of the other games, saw a very nice boost. In this case, it doubled the frame rate of the Core 2 Duo, bringing it up to around 60 FPS. Cities Skylines is known to be a CPU-intensive game, so I chose it to show the effect a more robust CPU would have on a game like this, and show it does. The X3220 is able to pull more than 3.5 times the frames of the Core 2 Duo, but in this case, it doesn't actually mean that the experience is smooth, just that the Core 2 Duo is really, really bad. However, at least the game is, existing in its entirety on the Core 2 Duo, so I suppose you could technically play it if you're able to stomach the frame rates. The Xeon did have some trouble when you would zoom in down close to the city, as it would drop down to around 12 to 14 FPS. But for most of the gameplay, it did hover around 22 FPS, which is quite playable considering that this is a pretty slow-paced game, and that a very high frame rate is not really required. The Core 2 Duo did pretty poorly, as you would expect. It had an average frame rate of only 6 FPS, and even when you zoomed all the way out, it never broke more than 12 FPS. Cities Skylines benefited immensely from the beefier Xeon. In this case, it brought it up to a playable 22 FPS. So while not perfect, at least it became something that you could actually use. Rise of the Tomb Raider is the first game to actually be pretty unplayable, even with the X3220. Even in the intro sequence, the frame rate couldn't hold a steady 30 FPS, and would only further drop in hub areas such as the geothermal forest. And considering that this is an action game, this frame rate isn't really acceptable. And on the Core 2 Duo, it's just more of what we come to expect at this point, though to an even greater extreme. The first problem, aside from the frame rate, shows up at less than 5 minutes in. Walking forward here should have triggered a cutscene, but instead it ended in this mess. I tried it a second time, and now we're good. Then, only shortly after that, this ice wall, which you're supposed to try to climb over, only for it to break apart and trigger another cutscene, again, just wouldn't start the cutscene. At first I thought I was actually just terrible at the game or something, but then reviewing my footage from the X3220, I realized that the computer was at fault. So I just let it sit here for a while, hoping that the computer would load it in or something, and it actually did. It just kind of started the cutscene by itself though, without me actually doing anything. And then again, less than 30 seconds after that, there was another cutscene which just ended in a mess. Though what's really interesting with this one is that the avalanche is actually updating at a slower refresh rate than the frame rate, causing this weird looking disconnect. And honestly, after having 3 almost game-breaking bugs within that short amount of time, I decided to not even test Geothermal Valley. So yeah, Rise of the Tomb Raider, not actually playable on either of the processors. So, should you run out and buy a CPU so you can swap it into your computer? Well, like most things, it depends. Overall, the Xeon did do much better than the Core 2 Duo. But if you look back, you can see that it is still pinned at 100% for much of that time, leaving no room to run background apps like Discord. And it also means that the GPU was not being taken full advantage of, leaving almost half of it idle in some cases. But you should also keep in mind that this isn't the fastest quad-core chip out there that will fit into this socket, so you might get even better results going with a higher end chip such as a Q9550 or a Xeon X3360, the latter of which I actually happen to have. However, I wasn't able to use it in this video because it doesn't fit into this computer, which brings me to the next problem, which is compatibility. Adding a CPU to an OEM machine like this is not the most straightforward upgrade. There's limited documentation of exactly what processors you can upgrade with, and these computers tend to be quite picky. And even if there is a list out there, it's still possible that you'd be able to upgrade to a CPU that wasn't mentioned, such as for this computer, where the Xeon was not on the list, but it ended up working anyway. So overall, I would recommend an upgrade, but only if you are pretty confident with messing around with your computer. And if you're going to upgrade, then get a processor that is faster than the one I showed in this video. That is, if your computer supports it. Because while this one does provide a large boost over the Core 2 Duo, it's still not always enough to break through the minimum spec for games. And it also leaves no breathing room for background apps such as Discord or Spotify or anything like that. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that video and found it informative. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon so you can stay informed about any future videos.